So, welcome all of you to our conference on human rights constitutionalism, global aspirations and local realities. Our goal for today is really to generate and foster a conversation around these papers, and the papers all impinge on the theme of the conference in different ways. Our idea was to look at the historical origins and political consequences of this shift, this move toward rights in political constitutions around the world, and in particular on the increasing movement of rights from international instruments and down into domestic constitutions. And the idea was to see sort of how different political communities are negotiating this boundary between, the supposedly universal aspirations that are contained in human rights instruments and the supposedly sort of more localized aspirations that are typically contained in constitutions and the expressions of the goals and ideals of a particular political community that we usually imagine constitutions as expressing. And all the papers do this to some extent, and all the papers do it in interesting ways and come at it in really different ways. So I hope that you'll be able to stay for many of the presentations. I think we've got a great set of panelists and a great set of papers, and I think it's really going to be an interesting day. The conference is our 10th annual Rapoport Center conference, the Bernard and Audrey Rapoport Center for Human Rights and Social Justice, and it's co-sponsored by the Center for European Studies, the Government Department, the Institute for Historical Studies, the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, and the South Asia Institute. We have some people here from those places, but not everybody, so I'm not going to name them particularly, but it's been remarkable for us as a center to get so much support from other centers around campus, not just for this conference, but for other conferences over the last few years, and so we hope to continue to work with them, and we are greatly appreciative of all they do to support us. I want to recognize some of the people who've done a lot of the work. Well, maybe we'll have to wait. Catherine's not here. She did a lot of the logistical work, and Billy Chandler is right over there. You've probably, if you came for this from out of town, he's been instrumental in getting you here, those of you who actually made it. We do have some attrition due to the weather on the East Coast. We had a number of people who couldn't come because they've been snowed in. And I guess that means more on the East Coast than what it means here in Texas. They had more snow than what we had when we shut down the university. And so that prevented them from flying. So Mila Versteeg wasn't able to come, Samuel Moyne wasn't able to come, and Manu Bhagavan, all three are stuck on the East Coast. So the paper presenters will present by Skype, so we'll have them up on the screen, so if you were hoping to see them present, you'll still get to see that, and we're going to try to facilitate a conversation, but it will be a little bit more mediated than otherwise would be the case. Should we say something about the setup? Yeah, so we've, in thinking about how to best advance fruitful conversation in this particular space, we thought we would do something different this time. So we have, each paper will be treated separately. We'll have a paper presenter and then a discussant. They'll each go for 10 minutes. And then we're going to give what we're calling the Greek chorus, which is the other presenters from out of town, a chance to just say something, to raise an issue, to say something provocative, to sort of set a number of themes that might be the axes of a conversation about the paper afterwards. And we're trying to keep it relatively informal and somewhat playful, and so we've called it a Greek chorus, and we expect that they'll say, witty and interesting things that will provoke lots of conversation. No pressure. So no pressure, but and then the author will sort of identify from among those themes some of the things that he or she would like to pursue further. And then we'll open it up to everybody to kind of go along those themes. And the moderator will keep track of all this and make it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds right.
So once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to the people who did so much work to organize it, and thank you especially to the paper presenters who are here, often traveling many, many long hours to be here. So thanks.
Great. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to add a couple of things and then segue right into the first panel, which I think I'm moderating. And first of all, I was asked to say something about food and drink, and I think I'll mention the sign that's outside the Berkeley computer room, which is absolutely no food and drink allowed in the computer room. That's the first thing mentioned. The second rule is if you do bring food and drink in, please don't spill it. And I think I might add something to Dan's prefatory comments. I mean, one thing about this conference is that it's highly interdisciplinary, and we had historians, political scientists, anthropologists, legal scholars, and yesterday, actually, we were going to have a panel which pitted historians and social scientists, not against each other, but with each other. It was going to be an encounter to talk about theory and to talk about their craft and get a sense of, sort of, in some ways, some of the assumptions underlying research in both those fields. And that was canceled because the historians couldn't make it. Some think they were intimidated. I don't know. You can use your own judgment. But anyway, that it was not there. But I think today what we'll see is the manifestation of that in the papers, and coming from very different approaches. So let's see. We have the ground rules are as such. I'm just going to summarize what Dan said. We've got the author will present for 10 minutes. The discussant will go for another 10 minutes. The Greek chorus, some say the jury. By the way, there was some discussion at dinner last night about whether it was desirable to be in the Greek chorus or not. Some were actually upset that they couldn't be in the Greek chorus. Others in the Greek chorus wanted to be out of it. So I'm sure if there's somebody who wants to be in, you'll find a willing taker to switch places. But anyway, the Greek chorus will go for a few minutes, however long it takes. Really, it's just a snapshot of your central reaction to the work in one sentence, no more than one sentence. And then we'll go to the audience. So if you're following along, it's ADGA, audience, discussant, Greek chorus, audience, ADGA. Sorry for the mnemonic, but it'll hopefully stick with you. So that's where we are, and the authors have already asked for more time, but I'm going to try to be a stickler so we can get to the last A in the ADGA mnemonic. For this first panel, we have, as a paper giver, as the author, Julieta Lemaitre Ripoll, who's at the University of Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and our own Sandy Levinson will be discussing the paper. And without further ado, Julieta.
So thank you all for having me and for being here on such a lovely winter day. I'm one of those who needs the extra minute, so here we go. I wrote this for a Colombian audience, and this is the first time I'm going to try to present it formally to a U.S. audience, and I'm not sure how it's going to come through. I'm working around this question: why do intelligent, experienced people in countries like Colombia invest so much time and energy in human rights claiming when they know the limited capacity of law as a tool for social change? And I have to say that in difference with a U.S. context, the common sense in Colombia is that law is really limited, and that basically it benefits the powers in charge and not the ordinary people. And this is sort of what people think. And yet at the same time, in extensive interviews with activists, they would come to a point where they would sort of flip the conversation. And after they stated all the limitations and the corruption and how bad it was, they would start to speak hopefully about law and really with intense emotion. And this is what I was trying to unpack. How could they have this ambivalence between the certainty that law benefits those in power and all the hopefulness and the emotional investment in the meanings of law? And the way I did it was with a series of case studies. The question of why is, of course, really difficult to answer. And it ended up being an emotional answer, and I found it particularly hard to talk about emotions in an academic setting. So what I'm going to try and do is invoke the meanings with the emotional charge that they have for the people that I interviewed. It refers to this conference, so my answer to that question would be that a broad human rights agenda, what this conference calls a broad human rights agenda, has an emotional appeal, and this emotional appeal is rooted in the discourse of universality. And this appeal is only measured with difficulty by empirical studies of the effectiveness of law. So this is 1985, and that what you're seeing is the Palace of Justice. It was the seat of the Supreme Court at the time. It's November 6 and 7, 1985. A small guerrilla called the M19, which was mostly middle-class people, took the Palace of Justice. It was 36 guerrillas, all but one were younger than 25. And the purpose was to keep the Supreme Court hostage and stage a trial of then-President Belisario Betancourt. In what has now been reported as a coup, the military sent all of its personnel in Bogota, over 2,000 armed men, to take back the Palace of Justice. The battle lasted for 2 days. All of the hostages died, including 11 Supreme Court justices out of court of 36. And this is sort of the epic moment when the tanks go in through the main door of the Palace of Justice. Over the door, there was this sign that said, the way you guys have seen it, you have to lettering in public buildings. So this is what it said. It said, Colombians' arms have given you independence, but the law shall set you free. So Colombia has identified itself after one of the regional founding fathers, which is General Francisco Santander, in opposition to Bolívar. Bolívar was incredible, is the great independence hero of Spanish America. He's the liberator of several countries. He was a military man, and he called himself a man of action. Santander worked mostly in Colombia. He was the second president of Colombia, and he called himself the man of laws. And he's the founder of the Liberal Party, and Bolívar is considered the founder of the Conservative Party. So in code, what Santander was saying, Bolívar was this great man who freed us from the Spanish Empire, but I will set you free because I am the man of laws, and it is laws that will set you free. So when the tanks came in under this sign, it was a statement of force overtaking reason and overtaking law, and it was a very emotional time. I interviewed close to 40 people who remember this time, and when they were talking about the 1991 Constitution, this came back as a reference, this moment. And then I started asking people, because I soon realized this was a big emotional moment, where were you November 6, 1985? And everybody remembered, and they would talk at length about this moment and what it had meant for them. Since about half of the people I interviewed were lawyers, they had lost professors or judges they admired in this confrontation. They remember where they were and what it meant for them. So in 1990, the government called for a constituent assembly to reform the then Constitution, the 1886 Constitution. This was clearly an unconstitutional call, because the 1886 Constitution had been amended in the 1950s to have a provision that said only Congress can reform the Constitution. It was in the text, there was no way around it. And surprisingly, the Supreme Court said that this was a constitutional call to amend the Constitution because, and I'm citing, and it's there, law does not belong to the sphere of logics. It is not simply a set of rules. Its ontological being lies in the world of values, and hence it requires the question of the utility of laws to realize the goals of a given community defined as valuable. One of these values is certainly peace. So he said, we're not declaring this unconstitutional because all the hopes for the Constituent Assembly in 1990 was that it would be a new peace pact. And some of the guerrillas wrote to the Supreme Court and said, we are betting on the Constituent Assembly. We will leave arms if there's a Constituent Assembly. And there was a huge popular pressure for a Constituent Assembly. And the Supreme Court just said, the Constitution might say this is unconstitutional, but it's not really. And when I went to law school in the U.S., and there's Holmes, and the logic of law has not been, I keep forgetting, it has been experienced. And this is sort of really important for U.S. culture. And I kept thinking about this phrase about how law does not belong to the sphere of logics, and just in opposition to that. So this is 1989. The sign says "No More Murders," and this is the student march of 1989, which was protesting the murder of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán in a long series of murders of politicians, journalists, and social justice advocates by different people, a lot of it by drug traffickers and also by the army itself. And it was a really complex time. And really, we didn't know who was kept murdering these leaders. The government itself didn't know and called it the Dark Forces, which sort of fit in with the Star Wars thing of the time. And this was also a major turning point for a new constitution. This is sort of the birth of the new constitution, this march, where students massively go out and they demand, and you would think they would, if you're protesting against violence, two things that were really symbolic happen. One is that traditionally marches in Bogota go through the main plaza because you're protesting against the government and it's a seat of government. So people march to the plaza and protest. This march was strange in that people met in the plaza and then they marched to the cemetery, as if they were protesting or we were protesting against the dark forces or against death. And it was a silent march because students usually sing slogans, but they didn't in this march. It was really a march of silence. And in the end, we just sang a song that protested against violence and demanded institutional reform, which I always thought was sort of weird that students would ask for institutional reform. But we did and massively backed the calling for the Constituent Assembly. When I interviewed one of the major student leaders at the time, and now she's an activist, and she, that's it? Wow.
Well, no, 2 minutes.
Okay, and she runs this major program that denounces the way drug lords have overtaken local politics. So she really knows the limitations of law for social change, and she did not have a critical position at all in the 1991 Constitution. This is what she said about it. With the new Constitution, we achieved a new social pact. I am absolutely convinced of that. It is the picture of what could be a possible country, the Constitution for a country that could be imagined beyond liberals and conservatives, a country of human rights that decided to be modern. And this is constant in the case studies that I looked at in the interviews. This moment where the activist I'm interviewing just stop being critical and go all romantic on the possibilities of law. So please ask me about my other examples. I'm just going jumping to the end here. So my interpretation of this ambivalence between knowing the limitations of law and just really passionately believing in goes with this opposition of pictures. So what's really the difference? Both are in Juarez, in the times of massive drug killings in Juarez, and one's obviously a dead dog, and the other ones are kids, I guess. So what's really the difference between the two pictures? It's what we are willing to believe is the difference. There's no natural difference between one corpse and the other. And there's really no natural difference between a human being and an animal in the sense of the things that you can do to it. And what, the span of our lifetime. The only difference is what we believe, what we construct is the difference. And I do believe that given our history and our context of extreme violence, the reason why people invest so much emotionally in law is that we want to believe there's a difference. We want to believe that there's something universal and sacred in the human. It's a political bet. It's a way of not giving up, one of my interviewees said. And I have a minute?
Yeah.
So this is what one of them said. What alternative did we have in 1989, knowing the war was coming down from the north and we had no choice but to arm ourselves and wait? But black people in the Pacific claimed their rights and chose that way. You choose a way of fighting. You either fight in terms of rights, or it's not so much that your whole life you're interested in the law. You're interested in living, in eating, in people going to school and having an education, being able to plant, to sell your produce. But when you're attacked, you have to defend yourself with the weapons that you do have. The path of war has been exhausted in Colombia as a way to solve deep structural problems. So communities have access to law. No, not access. They seek out the law as a way to avoid the path of war, which has been so sterile, so difficult, so costly to people and communities. And after 40 or more than 40 years of armed struggle in this country, the law is the only path that's available for people to, on the one hand, stop going down a path that's nowhere, and on the other hand, to avoid total hopelessness, that the realization that nothing can be achieved, that we're still nowhere. So this is my conclusion. If desire is awareness of a lack, then it is the lack of human dignity that constitutes a desire for human rights constitutionalism. It is awareness of that blankness in a human stare when suffering has washed away all that we consider human. Human rights law stands in that empty space and purports to fill it by naming people as victims, right holders, citizens. Even the trial of a monster renders him again human. Claims are made that he was tortured as a child, that he acted as a warrior, that he is ill with insanity, that evil is at the end of the day not radical but banal, every day the product of thoughtlessness, commensurable, abnormal, but not inhuman. It insists one more that we know and define and contain our laws what the human is. This is the reason why human rights constitutionalism often produces so much pleasure and is desired with so much passion by social justice activists, even beyond its instrumental effects.
Fabulous.
Okay.
Yes. So before we go on to Sandy Levinson and his comments, I'm going to suggest that at some point we try to go back to some of the photos that you flipped through, which gives more texture to this later in the session. So, Sandy Levinson.
Thank you. This is a very rich paper, and quite obviously, because of the time constraints, only a little bit was actually presented to you. But I would like to offer some brief comments about those parts that, in fact, were presented this morning. The first question is why intelligent, experienced people in countries like Colombia, or presumably anywhere else, invest so much time and energy in human rights claiming when they know the limited capacity of law as a tool of social change. I obviously know much more about the United States than I do any other country. This is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Both were the result of massive amounts of political and social energy. And one can ask, I think, the question more broadly, why do presumably rational people invest so much energy in purported legal change? What are the assumptions underlying that? One obvious assumption is that law makes a difference. This is an empirical question. It's not a conceptual question. With regard to the two acts that I referred to, that is the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, there's no doubt, in particular the Voting Rights Act, I think fundamentally transformed American politics in all sorts of ways. It is the Voting Rights Act, I think, that primarily, or not primarily, that goes a long way to explaining the current polarization in American politics, because it basically destroyed the party systems we knew it, particularly the Democratic Party, and substituted two much more polarized parties. But it also, certainly I think, did achieve the aim of including African Americans within the polity. We could also have extended discussion of the Civil Rights Act. So one answer is that one looks around and on occasion discovers that law seeming, or putting things in the statute books seemingly makes a difference. But then the obvious question is, under what conditions does it make a difference? It obviously requires a great deal not only of social mobilization, but support of relevant elites and judiciaries. One thing that struck me in reading your paper is how much mass energy seemed to be placed into the movements at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s. This did not seem to be, at least the way I read your paper, merely a movement of law professors or NGOs flying in from around the world with a relatively indifferent and cynical public. What seemed to be so striking was and I think the brunt of your paper, is the lack of cynicism on the part of huge swaths of the public who really got behind this. And I think it is always an interesting question, given the very good reason to be cynical about what the law can accomplish. How is it that over and over again, very smart people do decide that it's worth investing their time, energy, money, and sometimes their lives in social reform, legal reform? I think that is a fascinating question, especially as the costs get higher and higher, not only costs in time and energy, but you really are putting your life on your line. Why would you do that if you didn't think there was, in fact, a very significant payoff to formal legal change? And as you suggest, this is an empirical question, and one can look at a great deal of evidence suggesting there isn't much payoff. Indeed, I remember being very, very struck by Ona Hathaway's article several years ago that there's a negative correlation between the willingness of countries to adopt anti-torture conventions and the actual incidence of torture. That one picks up certain reputational advantages in signing the United Nations Convention Against Torture. And if you control the legal system, if you control the prosecutorial system, that is you, the torturer, then you can be pretty assured that you're, in fact, not going to be prosecuted. You're not going to be held accountable. Denmark presumably doesn't need to sign an anti-torture convention in order not to torture. Whereas other countries will sign these conventions in order to pick up a certain kind of international goodwill, secure in the knowledge that they're not, in fact, going to have to change their behavior. But I assume that countries that sign anti-torture conventions or other human rights conventions quite cynically do so. I mean, it's a move by political elites. I would assume that the very nature of an authoritarian or totalitarian political system is that there isn't a flourishing civil society and mass movements that bring these changes about. And so, I really am interested and would like to know more in the discussion about the degree to which there really were significant mass movements, and if they have made a measurable difference, even if the difference isn't enough or didn't conform to the more optimistic notions. If you put laws in the books, then they will immediately be transformed into action, which certainly is thoroughly naive. Nonetheless, have these laws proved simply fruitless or even negative in the way that some of the torture conventions seem to be even negative in their import rather than affirmative? And this is simply a question out of my own ignorance. I will confess one of the few things I know about the Colombian Supreme Court was the willingness, I think on at least two occasions, to suggest that the criteria for emergency conditions hadn't been met so as to push back some declarations of emergency. And I must say, as a North American liberal, this struck me as something quite affirmative. And so I'd be very curious to know more about that aspect of the new Constitution and presumably the rise to power of some relatively new elites. The other point I want to make with regard to your really fascinating story about the unconstitutional Constituent Assembly, I must say here the person I always think of, and when I reference him, I don't mean this as a negative reference, even though everybody knows that he was a Nazi, that is Carl Schmitt. Because if one takes seriously notions of popular sovereignty, and nobody took popular sovereignty, as a matter of fact, more seriously than Carl Schmitt. It's one of the things that makes him, I think, such a riveting philosopher. Then it can't be the case that any constitution could ever prevent the demos from drafting, from reestablishing itself as a constituent assembly and drafting a new constitution. Now, it's admittedly difficult for well-trained lawyers who are inclined to view constitutions as complete to explain why this is the case. And law does not belong to the sphere of logics. It is not simply a set of rules. It might be a pretty good start. That is to say, law works during times of normalcy. But when we, the people, wake up, then all bets are off. And what one has to hope, and then the question, should legal authorities, in fact, recognize the reality of the awakened demos rather than try to prevent it? And that's what you're describing. Whatever the logic, the experience is, in fact, that the demos had awakened, and that at that point one has to hope that what they will do will be for the best. But it did seem to me that this is kind of the pure Schmittian moment of popular sovereignty manifesting itself, and legal authorities at that point have to make a fundamental decision whether they really become devoted to preserving the existing order, or recognizing that once the demos awakens, there is no privileged existing order. Because of course, the people is a fictitious notion. Those people claiming to speak for the people are now saying that they have the freedom, the existential freedom, to inscribe a new political order. And then, of course, the question will be, how do new political orders become established and legitimate? And that presumably would be the question. And how long does it take? It obviously doesn't happen overnight.
Okay, great. Well, that's a lot to respond to right there, but we're going to very quickly
How much time do I have to respond?
Well, right now,
Not
we're going to go to the
okay.
Greek chorus, then we're going to go back to you.
Oh, right.
So,
I'm sorry. Yeah.
for those of you who came in late, we're now going to go to the Greek chorus. And again, the purpose is threefold. For the author, you're curious what all these people with blank stares actually think about what you just said, so they're going to give a quick reaction. In terms of putting things on the table, very quickly put some things on the table. And for the participants, it allows you to get something off your chest really quickly without having to justify it, which is always nice. So I'm going to just introduce by name quickly. Courtney Young, Kyutera Sutsui, James Melton, Paolo Bergaio, Tayeb Mahmood, and they're going to give very quick one-sentence responses. Then we're going to go back to the author, who can respond to the discussants and take up any of these threads, and then we're going to go to the audience. Okay, so Courtney. And I will keep notes for the authors.
My quick response is I wonder to what extent it's not only the content, but the method of law that is fetishized. So law is institutionalized, it's civilized, it's peaceful. And so an appeal to law can be something that's a protest against extra institutional political strategies. Maybe a way of thinking like we can just bring order to the public sphere. It might be another way of thinking about the appeal to law in the face of hopelessness.
Yeah, I'm going to count that as one sentence, but a run-on sentence. But that's okay. And I'm not going to try to sum it. But,
I actually have a lot to say. I think I'm going to go over one.
no.
Echoing some of what the said, I've done some quantitative analysis looking at the patterns of ratification in my treaties and practices, actually its impact on actual practices that we have confirmed. And in that analysis, we found that treaties don't have direct positive impact, actually they have negative impact. But when treaty provisions or the norms enshrined in those treaties are leveraged by civil society actors, when they mobilize treaty language to pressure the government to actually improve the practice, then the treaties actually have indirect positive impact on actual practice. So in that scenario, civil society actors are the de facto enforcer, implementer of the treaty, human rights law. And this story is very alarming to me because I got the impression that these actors, civil society actors, are, if not satisfied, somewhat resigned to the status quo or given up on making actual changes in practice. And they should be, according to my story, they should be the ones who are pushing government farther to actually implement the law that they want. So that part is very alarming.
So I wondered if you're being too hard on the law, right? Because you do describe these small wins in the paper, and so you don't ever see this huge kind of massive immediate social change, but maybe there's some accumulation of small wins over time, so you do get this sort of gradual change, right? And that somehow is the way that the law is working through that particular time.
I also shared this view that you're very hard on the law, and I think we discussed this in the past. I think you began your project some years ago when there was not empirical evidence about the impact of the court decisions. I think that in the last 5 or 7 years there have new studies been produced, Cesar Garavito's work and other empirical things showing eyes of change, and also that certain innovations have taken place, and I wonder whether these empirical studies, appealing also to some symbolic effects, etc., compete with your proposal to go to the emotional side in a different way that the evidence that was available when you began your work was included in the discussion. And I also have another little comment, is that the evidence of the way that law works was not available in 1991 probably, but the lead and the leaders of the constitutional drafting had the idealized story of the U.S. Like the Holocaust had not been published yet or was going to be published, and I think that they all had, or very prominent persons like Cepeda had studied in the U.S., so he had the evidence to have a rational call for law, and others had. I don't know if the peasant that you interviewed got that empirical evidence, but I think that the elite had the evidence that modernization needs law, and this was a pretty rational call.
I thought your story was a wonderful connective to the sort of settled, I would say, the notion of to look for constitution making and constitutions unfolding in panel for good rooms and sort of rather old men and all that, rather than where these tumultuous things happen out of which things grow. And in that sense, perhaps also a very welcome of my lights and border push towards which I am increasingly inclined that to the extent that perhaps all social theories fear of the mob, that perhaps all constitutions are to keep that beast contained, to forever postpone that Schmitzian moment of denial. And these are the times when you see it burst out and into a very welcome reminder.
Okay, great. I'm going to paraphrase something that Sandy says often when he talks about the view of those about the Second Amendment, which is, what part of shall not be infringed didn't you understand? And I'm going to paraphrase that to say, what part of one sentence didn't you understand? But that's okay. It's an unruly mob here in the jury box. I'm going to now turn to Julieta to give some responses, both to Sandy and to pick up any threads here, and then we'll turn to the audience.
So how much time do I have?
Not enough.
My authority has just vanished. Do what you can quickly to get to the audience. But remember, I'm sure.
Do you want to, I think I can thread it. Why don't we do the audience and then I can thread the whole thing?
That's a nice amendment.
Because they're themes.
Okay.
Is that okay?
That's what I'm saying. Okay. Questions, comments, reactions? Yes.
I think, listening to you do it. Okay. That for someone that looks at what's happening in a foreign country that you might have some involvement in, kind of like the way Sandy was approaching it, you can understand, an audience can understand what's happening in a foreign country that might be less developed. Let me give you an idea from a personal experience. There was a person from Israel that was talking at an audience of American Jews about the disparity between Jews and Israeli Arabs in Israel. And he had an accent. It was hard to understand him. But after a while, a high school student in the audience said, "Wait, are you saying that these schools that you have in Israel, that there are no mixed schools in Israel?" And he said, "Yes." Now, there's about 3 or 4, now maybe 5. For an American audience composed of American Jews, to hear the issues crystallized in that fashion, given the background of Brown versus Board of Education and our civil rights laws, it provides an opportunity for a discourse about, and a civilized discourse, about the issues that arise, the human rights issues that arise in a context of a nation that has employed American law in advancing its legal system. Now, they don't have segregation there. They have communities that are so far apart geographically and ideologically that they don't communicate. But that's what I see this issue about human rights. It provides a means for a discourse, a rational discourse about the way a society is organized.
So I want to pick up on something that Sandy said. I also had a question about, what happened after, but that's already been raised. And my question is, actually, it's one of the paradoxes with which we really started when we started thinking about this conference, and that is, this is a seminal moment. It's a foundational moment. The demos rises up. It calls for a new constitution, and yet it's founded in some sense in a judgment that the demos is somehow unfit to govern itself and therefore has to import human rights concepts or something, right? So who's being judged here by the people? Is it Colombia? Colombia, we've never been able to govern ourselves, therefore we need some foreign thing to come in and set us straight? Or is it the leadership? It's we the people are good, we understand it, that's why we're calling for this change, but our leaders have been unfit? Who's on trial, and the Constitution is an indictment of someone, and who's being indicted?
To piggyback just a little bit off what they were saying, and asking about whether there's been, it's striking that in relative terms there have been successes in the law in Colombia relative to a lot of Latin American countries, whether it's social and economic rights in the Constitutional Court, or even occasional human rights prosecutions, including 25 years later, convictions of generals for the Toma de Palacio. And so I'm wondering if this idea of fetishizing the law, if it's maybe quite different for people among the legal elite and then some farmer, in Choco. So for people among the elites, perhaps they are, the continued use of the law reflects episodic successes, whereas for people further down the socioeconomic scale, it's this more sort of abstract vision. So I'm wondering if there's not like a fairly substantial divide potentially within Colombia on this issue.
Maybe one more, and then we'll turn back to Julieta.
Okay, awesome. Could you talk just a bit more about Colombia's history of protest culture and student protest culture and its relationship to constitutionalism?
Real fast.
Patty.
Very quick question. From the perspective of social movements, assuming that there is a degree of evolution of what we would call a social movement in this demos, to what extent does this fetishization of law serve as a kind of hook or a rallying cry or some kind of focus that will bring organizational unity or at least some consensus amongst those who are protesting the status quo?
Okay, Julieta.
Sure. How long do I have? That's still a question.
Let's shoot. We have 8
How about
minutes
10
left
minutes?
in this panel.
Okay, so they're all night. So I'm going to pick up on some themes, I think, that will, I hope, get to most of this. The first one would be, and I really like that you brought up Schmidt, because the court actually cited Bobbio for this. And I'd say that there's the tension between a more liberal and a more, I don't know where you would fit in Schmidt, it's a full circle. And but the extreme left likes Schmidt more than they would like Bobbio, which is a solid liberal position. And then the difference is that the court said that the ontological being of the Constitution was not the expression of popular sovereignty, as you would expect, but peace. And that does go to the whole liberal theme of being afraid of violence and the link between violence and the people. And it's also part of our own history, because when we had our Enlightenment moment of independence, our two examples were the American Revolution and the French Revolution loomed large, and also Thermidor and the Robespierre and terror. And when you look at elites at that moment, there's an enormous discussion on how to avoid terror while being democratic, which you didn't have because it's a different moment in time, but it was a big theme in all of Latin America. And I think that I mean, it can be ironic to say that these are like 200-year impulses, but in a sense, there's that. Okay. So the second thing, and I think that goes to the whole issue of sovereignty, and the problematic link between the way that we see social movement, which is often not the same as claiming the sovereign has spoken. Actually, social movements are not the majority. In theory, these are people that don't really fit in the polity, and then they have a single issue moments, and that's when social movement comes up. So there's a lot to unpack there that I don't have the time. But I would like to single the role of violence as a way of maintaining the sovereign people at bay, but allowing social movement insofar as they are defending peace or protesting against violence. And on the issue of payoff of legal reform and evidence, that I think about the actual payoff of legal reform or signing treaties, that I think some of the Greek chorus was concerned about. What really drove my research was the fact that there was what I called an excess of emotion. I mean, there were some concrete gains, and you can point to the moment where people are actually better off because they use the court. But there was constantly just an excess of emotion and an excess of investment. And I'd love to talk about CSS research, but I wouldn't want to use up my 8 minutes. As to, and we can do that later, but as to Cepeda, who was a great architect of our 1991 Constitution, he came to the States in the 80s. And by then, it was way clear, as it is today, that the state has a huge racial problem that didn't even begin to go away with the end of segregation and Jim Crow. So I would say that he knew that law doesn't, even if there was no, like, the book hadn't come out, and you could say that Scheingold's book was out in the early 80s, but so there's that. So the whole thing about excess, and I want to go into part of my presentation, I think brings in the foreignness of it and our own tradition, and I kind of want to protest against the idea that this is a U.S. import, Dan. So this is an image of one of the publications of the destruction of the Indies, which you could say is the first human rights tract, right? And where Bartolomé de las Casas simply protests against the conquest and the mass murder of Indians. And his rallying cry the whole time is, are they not human? This is what he keeps telling the conquistadors. You're doing all these things to indigenous peoples. Are they not human? And, of course, he loses the big trial against Suarez, and so that the conquest is legal. But you have to think that the Spanish conquest stopped for months. Well, they had this enormous trial in Salamanca where Bartolomé de las Casas said this is an illegal conquest of the Indies because there are human people there and it is their land. And Suarez argued against that. So think of a foundational moment that's incredibly legalistic, that they have to say it's legal, that the conquest is legal. So eventually, Bartolomé de las Casas loses and the conquest is legal. And this is the 1973 trial of La Rubiera. So now I'm just going to play with history. And the people that you see in the back, those are the defendants. On Christmas Day in 1967, they invited a family group of nomadic Wahibo Indians to have lunch, and it was a setup. They murdered them for sport, including 4 children, one of them a breastfeeding baby. 2 of the family tribe escaped. They captured the defendants, who were illiterate peasants, homesteaders in the frontiers of agricultural expansion, and the defense was that they were under the protection of invincible error. And if you remember invincible error, I don't know if you have this in the U.S. criminal system, but when a person who has objectively committed acts that are typified as a crime is proven without a doubt that he could not have understood at the time that he was committing the acts that are imputed. In this case, invincible error was claimed as they could not have known that this was a murder, because there was no way they could have known that indigenous people were people. And the whole defense proved that at the time where they lived, it was common sport to hunt and kill Indians. 1967, 1968. That in the region there was a verb, guajibiar, which meant hunting and killing Wahibo Indians. And that there was no way these illiterate peasants could have known that these were human beings. And that's 1973. So that when in 1991 we elected by some sort of chance an indigenous constituent to the Constituent Assembly, and he spoke up. He went to the lectern, and that's where he said the lectern, and he starts speaking in his native tongue, which was completely odd for our culture. And then he switches into Spanish. He says, I am one of 600,000 surviving Indians. And the fact that you could not understand the beginning of his speech meant we are still here, we're still alive. So on the one hand, you could say, well, what's the flesh and blood continuity in 500 years? So in that case, I guess I'm French, And you could sort of be cynical about it. And then I want to go back to Sandy's point on cynicism. You could be, and also on your point about about the relationship with what people on the ground would think and what the elites would think. There's an encounter there, and there's different moments of encounter that I'm sure I've spent more than my 8 minutes. So there's different moments of encounter between legal elites and people on the ground. And you could be really critical about this and say they're making it up. They're not really indigenous peoples, they're peasants. And some of them speak the tongue, most of them don't. What's the continuity here? What's the fairness of it? But I find it really ethically challenging to be cynical about this guy who's standing up there saying, we are the indigenous peoples, we have rights. So when I interviewed some of them, and I actually had an assistant interview others because they wouldn't talk to me, and my assistant was indigenous, and she was my student, she knew me, so I got her to interview. One common theme was this same ambivalence between, on the one hand, being very instrumental, and I loved it, one of them said, well, you know, the law is the religion of the government, and you just have to understand the religion and go with it, which seemed very pragmatic and practical. And on the other hand, just this excess of emotion and this insistence that indigenous rights are real and important and that they were really the indigenous people. And that ambivalence between the cynicism and the pragmatism and the whole emotional appeal, I think can only be explained if you go back to the trial. So I think that the payoff would be the emotional moment where you say, are they not human? Right? Just the statement of full humanity. That is an emotional payoff, and it's real. You know? You get a thrill. And this is one thing that social movement theory, so one of the frameworks that I looked at when I was doing this was, should I use social movement theory? You know, how do you talk about this? And sociology of emotion just seemed very, I'm sorry to say, poor, because it could not just capture the complexity and the intensity of the pleasure that comes from the statement that they are human and that this is not possible. And I wanted to capture it, which is, I ended up using like literary methods, and here I'm using images. Yeah, so that's that. Okay.
Great. Well, we should leave it there. And undoubtedly we'll weave some of these ideas into the other presentations. And so the train left the station late this morning, but we're making all the stops at the right time. We did 45 minutes there in that session. So let's move without further ado to Courtney Young, who's next. And I'm going to invite Gary Jacobson to come up to give comments. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Yeah.